There is a quiet ritual that happens inside a small tea room in Kyoto every morning before sunrise. An elderly woman kneels beside a low table, places both hands on her knees, and speaks four words out loud to no one but herself. Not affirmations copied from a self-help book. Not forced positivity chanted through gritted teeth. Just four plain words, spoken the same way every single day, that quietly keep her mind steady in a world that gives her every reason not to be. Meanwhile, somewhere else right now, someone is lying awake at 2 in the morning, replaying a conversation from 6 hours earlier. Narrating their own failures back to themselves in a voice that would never be allowed to speak to a friend that way. Same species, same brain structure, completely different internal world. What if the difference between these two people has almost nothing to do with confidence, and almost nothing to do with circumstance, and almost everything to do with how they've each been quietly trained without ever realizing it to talk to themselves? By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what that quiet training looks like, and why a handful of old Japanese language habits can begin rewiring self-doubt as early as tonight. Before we get into the habits themselves, we need to examine an assumption almost everyone carries about self-doubt. The assumption is this: negative self-talk is simply personality. Some people are naturally harder on themselves, others aren't, and there isn't much to be done about it beyond forcing positive thoughts when the negative ones show up. This belief is comforting because it removes responsibility, but it also traps people in a loop because forced positivity almost never works. The mind recognizes a lie faster than it recognizes a lesson. What actually shapes self-talk isn't personality at all. It's language structure, repetition, and the tiny linguistic habits absorbed from culture long before adulthood. This is the piece almost every self-help framework quietly skips: the real Japanese term Jibun ni Yasashiku. Being gentle with oneself, not in the sense of excusing failure, but in the sense of speaking to yourself the way you would speak to someone you were responsible for protecting. The practice, instead of narrating a mistake with condemnation, the internal voice is trained to narrate it with observation. Not "I always ruin everything, but that didn't go the way I hoped." The words are chosen deliberately, almost formally. The same way a parent might choose careful words with a child who just fell down. The scientific validation. Research in cognitive linguistics has shown that the specific words used in self-talk directly shape the emotional intensity of the experience being described. Vague, absolute language like always and everything activates broader threat responses in the brain than specific, bounded language, which keeps the nervous system from escalating a single mistake into a global identity crisis. The second habit involves the distance created between the self and the thought. In most Western inner monologues, thoughts are spoken in first person, fused directly to identity. "I am such an idiot," the real Japanese term Jibun wo mitsumeru, to observe oneself, as though from a slight distance, the way one might observe weather passing outside a window. The practice, rather than fusing with a thought, it is acknowledged as something passing through, not something that defines the whole self. A moment of frustration becomes, "There is frustration here," rather than "I am frustrated." A subtle shift that creates just enough space for the emotion to move through without becoming a verdict. The scientific validation. Psychologists studying self-distancing techniques have found that shifting from first person to more observational language during distress reduces amygdala reactivity and allows the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reasoning, to stay engaged rather than getting overridden by panic. The third habit is built around ritual repetition rather than one-time correction. The real Japanese term, kotodama, the belief that words themselves carry a kind of spirit or energy, and that repeating certain phrases shapes the reality they describe. The practice, short, simple phrases repeated at consistent times of day, not as a desperate fix during a crisis, but as a quiet daily maintenance habit. The same way brushing teeth prevents decay rather than treating it after the fact. A phrase said every morning while getting dressed, a phrase said every evening before sleep. The scientific validation. Neuroscientists studying habit formation have found that self-talk patterns become measurably more automatic and more believed the more consistently they are repeated at the same contextual trigger point, meaning the timing of repetition matters as much as the content of the words themselves. The fourth habit concerns how effort rather than outcome gets acknowledged. The real Japanese term, ganbatta, roughly meaning "you tried hard," a phrase used constantly in Japanese households and schools regardless of whether the outcome was a success. The practice, internal language is trained to recognize effort explicitly, separate from result. Instead of measuring self-worth purely by whether something worked, the process itself is named and honored. I prepared well for that exists as its own true statement, independent of whether the outcome matched hope. The scientific validation. Studies on self-compassion and motivation have consistently found that people who acknowledge effort independently of outcome show greater resilience after failure and are more likely to attempt difficult tasks again, compared to those whose internal language ties self-worth entirely to results. The fifth habit involves the quiet acknowledgement of impermanence in emotional states. The real Japanese term, mono no aware, a gentle awareness of the transience of things, traditionally applied to fleeting cherry blossoms, but just as easily applied to a difficult emotional moment. The practice, rather than treating a wave of self-doubt as a permanent condition, it is internally labeled as temporary by nature. This feeling, like the blossom, will not stay in this form. The scientific validation. Research on emotional regulation shows that framing difficult emotions as temporary states, rather than fixed traits, significantly shortens their duration and reduces their intensity. Because the nervous system responds differently to something it believes is passing versus something it believes is permanent. The sixth habit is about the specific word choice used when describing personal identity. The real Japanese term, Jibun rashisa, being like oneself, an idea rooted not in comparison to others but in consistency with one's own nature. The practice, internal comparisons to other people are replaced with internal comparisons to one's own past self. Instead of why can't I be as capable as them, the trained phrase becomes how does this compare to where I was last year? The scientific validation. Social comparison research has repeatedly found that upward comparison to others is one of the strongest predictors of chronic self-doubt. While comparison to one's own historical baseline produces steadier, more sustainable motivation with far less emotional volatility. The seventh and final habit is the quietest of all, and it happens at the very end of a difficult day. The real Japanese term, atsukersama, an expression said to acknowledge someone's effort at the close of a task, often translated loosely as you must be tired, used both toward others and, in this practice, toward oneself. The practice, before sleep, the day is acknowledged not with judgment about what was or wasn't accomplished, but simply with recognition that effort was expended and the day is now complete. The scientific validation. Sleep researchers have found that unresolved self-critical rumination before bed is one of the strongest predictors of both poor sleep quality and next-day emotional reactivity. While a brief closing ritual of acknowledgement measurably reduces pre-sleep cognitive arousal. As you've seen, rewiring self-doubt has very little to do with forcing yourself to feel confident. It has to do with 7 small linguistic habits practiced quietly every single day. Speak to yourself with the deliberate care of Jibun na Yasashiku. Create distance from difficult thoughts through Jibun wo mitsumeru. Repeat steady phrases through kotodama. Acknowledge effort independent of outcome through ganbatta. Recognize the impermanence of hard emotions through mono no aware. Compare yourself only to your own past through Jibun rashisa. And close each day with the quiet respect of Atsuker-sama. None of it requires becoming a different person. It requires becoming a slightly gentler narrator of the person you already are. If this changed the way you think about your own inner voice, please like this video and subscribe so we can continue unlocking this kind of practical Japanese wisdom together. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these 7 habits are you going to try first tonight? Leave it in the comments below. Until the next video.